Hi there, Benton Street. Oh man, I wish I could be there with you. The whole family wishes we could be there with you, but we're glad to be able to check in with you this way and say hello. Before we get started with our exploration of the scriptures for today, I thought I'd give you a brief update on how the family's doing. So the kids are doing great. Everybody's doing well in school, making friends, continuing to root here slowly and work their way into the social networks that already exist. Joy and I are doing the same thing, making new friends, continuing to expand our own social networks, both among those who follow Jesus and those who don't yet. We're expecting baby number 5 in a few weeks, early July. We're very excited about that. So we will have one at 0, one at 17, and a few in the middle, and it's going to be crazy here. Now, if you don't know where we are, for this video, I'm going to say Southern Europe. You can ask around and people can tell you where we live. But we're on the Mediterranean coast in Southern Europe. It's sunny and warm, and we're looking forward to a raging hot summer, just like every summer. We hope to come back to North America next summer and see all of you. But for now, let's get right into the message. There's a phrase that occurs in all of the synoptic gospels, the synoptic gospels being the gospels that look at the life of Jesus from the same point of view. Those would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This phrase occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke with considerable frequency, enough frequency that it demands special attention. And that phrase is moved with compassion. So today we're going to look at how Jesus' earliest disciples remembered him, remembered how he thought about God, and remembered how he thought about us. Now, the word in Greek that's translated moved with compassion, and it might be in your translation, moved with pity or had compassion. It's splachnizomai. So hard to say, super challenging to spell, but it comes from the Greek word for guts. It's the idea of being moved deeply in your belly. It's a compulsion, a deep, deep sense that something must be done. It doesn't occur in John. John was written significantly later than the other 3 Gospels, and this suggests that the earliest Jesus communities had a habit of remembering Jesus as compelled by compassion. They remembered Jesus as an intensely emotional man, not an emotionally unstable man, but also not the calculating, level-headed strategist that I was raised to see him as. This compassion seemed to overcome him and demand action on his part. It starts down in the belly and it doesn't end until the wrong is righted. Now, in English, the word compassion is compound. It means to suffer with. Passion meaning suffering and come meaning with. So it's not so much feeling badly for somebody, feeling sad for someone's situation. It is feeling what they're feeling with them. It has to do with mirror neurons and actually giving someone your undivided attention such that it's possible for you to experience inside you what they're experiencing inside them. When I was a kid, there were these Save the Children commercials, and they would show pictures of children with flies on them, and they were moving commercials. And then they would tell you for the price of a cup of coffee a day or something like that, you can feed children. That's good and beautiful. The compassion that we're talking about in the Gospels isn't something that causes you to see the Save the Children commercial and give your pocket change. It's something that causes you to see the Save the Children commercial and go to Africa to deal with the problem, or failing that, sell the extra car so somebody else can. Again, this kind of compassion pushes the one who is experiencing this deep belly level compulsion to act until released by God or until the wrong is righted, until the job is done, until the situation is changed. So if you're a Bible nerd like I am, you're going to want to look at every one of these passages. We're not going to look at them all today. We're going to look at the ones in Luke. We're going to stick with one gospel writer and look at the 3 passages in Luke. But here on the slide are all the places where moved with compassion occurs in the synoptic gospels. But Jesus does a lot of stuff moved by compassion. This was important to me when I discovered it some years ago. Coming up in an evangelical seminary, I had this false dichotomy in my mind that the Bible drives us to preach the gospel and to teach the scriptures, and compassion drives us to feed the poor and heal the sick as needed to make opportunity to preach the gospel and teach the scriptures. But in fact, everything Jesus does, that's in his whole story arc in the synoptic gospels, at some point or another gets attached to this compassion. Jesus heals, He feeds, he teaches, he raises the dead, he exorcises demons, and even mobilizes workers for the harvest, all attached to this compassion. Some of his most significant miracles are attached to this compassion. And it's not that the miracles come from compassion and that the teaching comes from some strategic decision. He sees the multitude like sheep without a shepherd and teaches them many things. At some point or another, everything that Jesus did in the Gospels gets attached to this compassion. So let's take a few minutes and look at these three passages in Luke to examine the compassionate Jesus, his compassionate God, and his compassionate people. Since we're smart people, we'll start with Jesus. So our passage is Luke 7:11-17. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. So already the scene is set as crowd on crowd. And Jesus is coming with a great crowd with him. And then Luke introduces this dead man. And it's easy to make the mistake of thinking that the rest of the story is going to be about Jesus and the dead man, but it's not. The dead man just opens the door to the woman. He's the only son of his mother, and a great crowd was coming with her. So there's this sea of people meeting a sea of people on the edge of town, in the space between spaces. Luke has painted this brilliantly. Now, if you're unfamiliar with first century Palestine, a woman that didn't have her husband anymore and didn't have a son was destitute. He appears to be an adult son, so she's older. The only thing open to her now is maybe prostitution, but she may have aged out of that possibility. She has nothing, and she has no means of getting anything, and there is no social net to catch her. She has lost her whole world. So in this sea of people, meeting a sea of people, Jesus sees her. And when the Lord saw her, verse 13, he had compassion on her. It actually translates better. He was moved. He was moved with compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. Let me help you get this a little clearer. What he didn't do was say, weep not. But instead, do not weep here maybe translates better. Oh, don't cry, don't cry. He sees her. He only has eyes for her. And he comes up and touches the bier, which makes him ritually unclean and unable to do whatever he was going to do next. Whatever very important, missionally significant act he was up to next is off the table. He's touched the coffin. So the bearer stood still, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. This is the only thing he says to the young man. The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. We don't know what he began to say. We don't care. Luke doesn't care. Nobody cares, because this story isn't about Jesus and the young man. It doesn't matter what he has to say. Jesus only has eyes and ears for this lady. So he takes the speaking, who cares what he has to say, young man, a live young man, back to his mother, gives him to her, again, ignoring the crowd, ignoring the young man's speech, disinterested in anything but her. He can only see her, gives him to his mother, and leaves. It says, fear seized them all, and they glorify God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people, and this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. Let me tell you, I follow Jesus because of what he has done inside me, and I follow Jesus because I believe in the historical reliability of his resurrection from the dead and its significance as the reason why we should listen to him over against all other people. But even if I didn't have all of that, I would follow Jesus just because of this story. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The first time I read this and saw what I see now, I was dumbstruck and fell head over heels in love with Jesus. I was maybe in my early 30s when I noticed that Jesus didn't make a speech here, but I would have. I would have said, look, the dead man is now alive. You can see that the hand of God is present amongst you. Repent, give up your desires of overthrowing Rome, and give up your wandering far from the fold, and follow me. I would have, if I had been Jesus, I would have used the product of that compassion for good ends. But the compassion of Jesus is not utilitarian. When Jesus is moved with compassion toward someone, toward you, he's only got eyes for you. And he's going to move and keep moving until the thing that has you hung up is gone. Jesus makes the sad things come untrue when he feels your sadness in his heart. But this shouldn't surprise us, right? Because Jesus is God incarnate. And that is one of the reasons I follow him, right? He is God incarnate. He's not just a beautiful man that completely ignored the crowd, completely abandoned any opportunity to use this fantastic moment for ministerially, strategically significant reasons. He is actually God. And so it shouldn't surprise us that the God that Jesus presents in his stories and in his teaching is just as compassionate. To consider that, let's look at Luke 15, 11 to 32. It's a very familiar passage of scripture. It's the prodigal son. So Jesus is telling a series of stories about lost sheep and lost coins, and this one's going to be about a lost son. Pay attention to what the God character does in this story. And he said, there was a man who had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Now, having lived in Central Asia, I can tell you that this didn't sound like that to his father. It didn't, or to Jesus's first audience. Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. It sounded like, forget you, forget your life, forget what you've done for me, forget the family business, forget my brother, forget all of you. I wish you were dead. It's very inconvenient that you're not, but since you're not, can I just have my inheritance now and I'll go? That's how that sounded. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, right? There's no courtesy period to demonstrate that maybe he wasn't just trying to get the money. The younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. So he squandered half his father's glory. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed the pigs. If you're familiar with Jewish custom, Jews don't feed pigs, but that's what he was reduced to. And he was longing to be fed with the pods the pigs ate. He was so hungry he was going to eat the pig food, right? So he gets in desperate straits and no one gave him anything. So that phrase, no one gave him anything, is important because the father already gave him half his stuff and he's about to go ask his father to give him something still more. But in the middle, he has nothing, he's lost everything, and no one can see him. No one cares about him. He is not the recipient of compassion. Maybe he's invisible and it's his fault and he knows it. So he doesn't feel worth becoming visible to anybody. So Jesus goes on. But when he came to himself, like when he woke up, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him this special speech which I will prepare in the hopes that if I get the words right, I'll get the forgiveness. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. 3-part speech. And he rose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. In the first century world, even in Central Asia where we used to live, you don't run. You never run. Nobody runs. The only people who run, the only people who might run are servants, slaves even. You don't lose your dignity or risk your dignity by acting like you're not in control of the situation. Men don't run. But this old man does. He hikes up his skirt and he sprints and he grabs his boy and hugs him and kisses him. And the son said to him, here comes the speech he prepared. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. Part 1. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Part 2. Here comes part 3. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him and put a ring on his hand. This isn't just a random piece of jewelry. This is the signet ring that allows him to do business as a shareholder in the family business. And shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. He doesn't even get his speech out of his mouth. When I was a kid, I was pretty scrupulous. somebody in my family led on that I really needed to make sure that I kept short accounts with God. And so I needed to confess all my sins before I fell asleep at night because I didn't want to die in my sleep or have Jesus return and have something on my account. Total misunderstanding of grace and on the sacrifice of Jesus. But nonetheless, I would confess every sin that I might have committed in the terror that I would be caught unawares in my sleep. But if I really committed like a real one, like a sin that I thought was particularly dirty or that I shouldn't do again, that I've done so many times, like if it was one of those repeat offender sins that we've got, I found myself compelled to try to get the confessing right, as though God were slow to forgive, as though God didn't like to forgive, as though God hadn't told Moses to tell Israel, I am Yahweh, compassionate and difficult to anger, abounding in loving kindness. And man, I love to forgive. This boy had the same scrupulosity I had, but he didn't get to get his speech out. Before he was able to try to clean up his act with his words, the Father overwhelmed him with grace and acceptance and dignity. And the reason the Father did this is because he was moved with compassion. When Jesus has an opportunity to tell us what God is feeling about us, when Jesus has a chance here to tell you what God is feeling about you, when you are in a far country with bloodied knees and filthy hands, Jesus says, God is feeling compassion. God feels so sorry with you, for you, when you are far away. I think I needed to know what God feels like when I'm all kinds of wrong. But knowing that that's how God feels makes me come home so much faster. And it keeps the shame from sticking to me. Now, the older brother was no stranger to shame or to shaming other people. So he gets in a huff, right? He's out in the field, and this is what the servant says in 27. Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But the brother, he was angry and refused to go in. So the servant says, your brother has come. Hold that in your mind. But he, the older brother, was angry and refused to go in. So his father comes out. And let me just pause here for a moment and let you know something. A friend of mine is like the older brother in the sense that he's never really gone wandering in the far country. He's stayed close to God, and he's kept his hands fairly clean as a person can keep their hands in a world like the one we live in, with the hearts like the ones we've got. And he's wondered if God can see him. And a friend of his told him, the father went looking for the older brother too. His father came out and entreated him, begged him to come in. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, not this brother of mine, this son of yours, and this is the opposite of compassion. The father is moved with compassion and moves toward his son, hugs him and kisses him and filthies himself. He abandons his own glory to get his son embraced. And I think in a period in evangelical history where we have really doubled and tripled down on God's glory, it might be worthwhile to notice that sometimes God drops his glory to get you and to get me. Compassion drives us toward the other, regardless of what we might get on us. Discompassion, hardness of heart, causes us to create distance. And this is distancing language. But when this son of yours, not this brother of mine, but this son of yours comes back, who's devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. And again, this is important. His father hears him say, this son of yours. And earlier on in the passage, he had said, for this my son was dead and is alive again. But now the second time the father uses the same phrase, he says, this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. There are a couple of things that Jesus is doing with this story. One, he's letting you know that when you are far away, he is looking for you. And what's happening inside him is compelling compassion. God feels your sorrow with you. He feels the dehumanization of your sin with you. He feels your loss of dignity with you. What God is feeling when you are at your worst is compassion. Now, the second thing Jesus is doing is he's beginning to invite us to the same compassion. When this, your son, went out and ruined everything, the father says, yes, this, your brother, has come home. In this story, Jesus paints God as a character who is trying to invite us into the same kind of compassion that he is experiencing. So that brings us to Luke 10, the Good Samaritan. Behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he, Jesus, said to him, What's written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. So that is the law. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live. And if he could have just left it alone, but no, he was here to test Jesus. He wasn't here to be tested himself. But that's going to happen next. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Who am I actually responsible to love as myself, to treat as important as me, to go out of my way to help as I go out of my way to help myself? Who is my neighbor? And Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. This is a famously dangerous stretch of road. And he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. This is probably even a common story. Like many rabbis probably used a version of this story. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, these are ancestral enemies of the Jews. No one hates a Jew like a Samaritan. No one hates a Samaritan like a Jew. Hate, right? But a bad guy, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So let's stop for just a moment. When I was growing up, I was sometimes taught that the Levite and the priest maybe had an excuse because they weren't supposed to touch someone, because maybe what if he was dead? Then they would be defiled and they couldn't go do their job. Levite and the priest actually, according to Torah, were responsible to help. They abdicated their responsibility as human beings and as people with God's name on them. They were supposed to help, and they didn't. The Samaritan is not supposed to help. The Samaritan is almost always the bad guy in the story. And what's interesting is that the Levite and the priest pass by, but the Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was. Textually, it's an intentional contrast between just going by, right? I didn't beat this guy up. I didn't take his stuff. I didn't leave him in a ditch. I just lived my life. That's the contrast. Jesus never draws a contrast between the robbers and the Samaritan. He draws the contrast between the people like me who just go by and live my life, who can't see and won't go to where they are. But the Samaritan came to where he was. And when he saw him, and this is how it happens for Jesus, this is how it happened for God in the last story, when he saw him, he had compassion. He was moved with compassion. And remember that this compassion drives you to act all the way until the problem is solved. So let's see how far it goes with this guy. He went to him and bound up his wounds well. He poured in oil and wine. So he didn't just wrap him up. He tried to treat the wounds. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn. And there at the inn, he dropped him off and left. Nope. He took care of him. And then the next day, he said, Goodbye, I hope you do well. Nope. He took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, Take care of him. I want to make sure he's well. I got to see this through. Whatever more you spend, I'll pay you. Just make sure he's all right. When I come back, I'll pay you. So Jesus asks. So here's this compassion that goes like well past anything reasonable, all the way. The Samaritan can't stop until the man's well-being is secured. Which of these do you think, Jesus said, proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. He couldn't even say the Samaritan. This bigoted punk couldn't even say the Samaritan, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, Do that. Now remember that this parable is being offered in answer to the question, who's my neighbor? And that question was offered merely to justify himself when he was told, you're to love your neighbor as yourself is really what you're supposed to be doing. So remember that there are two great commands that are really one. That's what Jesus means when he says, the first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. And he says the second is just like it, which means it's the other side of the exact same coin. It's not two commands. It's the other side of the same coin. Love your neighbor as yourself. They are the same thing. If you do not do the one, you are not doing the other. And it is by doing the one that you are driven to do the other. This is why John can say, how can you say you love God whom you haven't seen and hate your brother who you can see? How you treat your neighbor is how you treat God. So Jesus is describing for his students what loving your neighbor is supposed to involve. And it appears that for Jesus, it involves going to where they are, seeing them, actually giving them your undivided attention, letting their situation move you, and even better, move Jesus inside you to act until the story changes. That's the most vivid picture of loving your neighbor I have found anywhere in the text. And I got to tell you, I need it because everything in me wants to come up short of that. Everything in me wants to define loving my neighbor as being a nice guy, loving my neighbor as not robbing them and leaving them in a ditch, loving my neighbor as parking my car politely and trying not to use the horn early in the morning. But loving my neighbor costs my attention. And then it always involves the risk that my heart might move when I see them as they are. That's the dangerous part, because love always costs. So let's review. The earliest Jesus people remembered him predominantly as an appropriately emotional man. I grew up with Jesus as like this Jedi mystic that made calculated decisions at all times, and that emotion was bad and couldn't be trusted, like as though the fall damaged our emotions and made us crazy people with our emotions, but left our rationality and our intellect completely untouched. That is a silly and preposterous proposition. Your emotions are as fallen as your rationality, and your rationality is as fallen as your emotions, and you can use them both to follow Jesus. They remembered him as a man compelled by compassion in his guts. The compassion of Jesus is, to me at least, captivating, beautiful, and not in the least utilitarian. Jesus, who is the authority on God, presents God. So like if you disagree with Jesus, one of you is wrong. And I'm going to bet it's not Jesus. Jesus, the authority on God, presents God as also compelled by compassion. God feels sad for you, sad with you, but not sad about you. God sees you, not just what you did. And his heart breaks with your broken heart. And that's the truth. Jesus equates loving God with loving your neighbor, and that in turn with being moved with compassion. A dispassionate love of neighbor does not exist in Jesus's imagination. In Jesus's imagination, love of neighbor is profoundly compassionate. And that's the invitation to growth. The invitation to growth for you and for me is to risk letting Jesus grow our heart's ability to feel the pain of the people we see. It might cost us a lot to cover that difference, but that's the difference between being Jesus's disciple and being a spectator. All right, I hope you found something useful in that you can take with you and hold before the Lord and to see if there's something for your discipleship in that. I was also asked to give you an update about what we're doing. And I'd like to stay with the theme of compassion because it is actually driving most of what we do. So compassion in our work in Southern Europe. So Joy and I occupy a leadership role overseeing staff that are scattered all over the world. So for the past several years and continuing now, we're attempting to change the way it feels to lead and to be led within our organization. It's costing us an increased amount of attention that we pay to our people. We reach out to them and we look in on them and we talk to them and we see them and we approach them with vulnerability so that they in turn can also be vulnerable. We pay deep, frequent attention. If you want to grow in your compassion, pay deep, frequent attention. But we're not just checking in on them, we're also developing them. As we see this picture of Jesus in the Gospels, There's sort of two ways that Jesus is led to act. The first being frequent, deep, protracted periods of solitude and prayer. It's in these periods we're convinced that Jesus is able to take on the heart of his Father, but also to like put down all of the need and grief and hurt that he's accumulated walking through a broken world. It's where Jesus appears to get his overarching strategic direction. But then on his way places, he runs into people and he appears to be interruptible enough that he can pay deep attention to them. He can see them. He can come to where they are, see them, and be moved with compassion on them. So to be able to nurture that kind of inner space requires a contemplative depth of spirituality, like a deep well. You can't be a spiritual list ticker and be moved like Jesus is moved. So we're increasing their competencies with discernment and listening prayer, and we're trying to cultivate their emotional intelligence. I know that in the traditions that we're from, emotions aren't talked about and aren't stewarded terribly well. Abuses in the other direction, like emotionalism, have perhaps made us a little bit allergic to our feelings. But abandoning half your brain because you're uncomfortable with it is a bad way to be guided. It's like sailing a ship with half the sails. We're intentionally helping our staff cultivate their emotional intelligence, believing that as their emotional competencies continue to get turned on and developed, more and more of their hearts will become available for Jesus to guide and to move. Many of you know that we're here on the southern coast of Europe and that there are a lot of refugees coming across the sea. Recent political changes around COVID actually have increased the numbers of refugees flooding our shores. Many don't make it across the sea. Those that do make it across the sea face incredible challenges when they get here. I don't like illegal immigration. I love illegal immigrants. How you feel about immigration should have nothing to do with how you feel about immigrants. And that's something that has been challenging to cultivate in the church here in Southern Europe, a compassion that outstrips their frustration. Some who come have come legally, and some have been here for a while, and they often come to our Immigrant and Refugee Services Center. Our friend Julie works there and is a relationship engine. And she has made so many friends and then goes to see them outside of the center, finds where they live in the city and goes to see them. One of her friends, Hagar, comes to this refugee services center for food. She comes for food. And her husband is a barber, like has a legit job and is a barber. And they've got kids and it's hard to support them. So we started asking her husband to come into our house to do our haircuts. So the first time he came with Julie and he came with his two kids who played with our kids. And then since then he has come more and he brings his kids every time. So there are these multiple points of contact between our family and Hagar's family that emerged from taking an opportunity to be helpful. That opportunity happened because Julie could see Hagar, and Julie can see Hagar because God sees Hagar. God's always been seeing Hagars, hasn't he? Sometimes the immigrant and the refugee looks like a person on a dinghy clinging to life. And sometimes they look like your neighbor. And in both cases, if you want to approach them properly, we got to approach them with compassion. And then finally, I want to leave you with something that's a little bit new to us: compassion for the indentured servant. There are forms of slavery that still exist in the world, that still exist in the West. And this is one of them. I'm going to tell you a story that starts in Central Africa. This story is actually a composite of many stories. It's been hard to get together all the pieces of how this happens. And that's part of why so little is being done about it. This story is a true story. It may not be a literal story of one individual, but it is a composite of many individual stories. And it is, as far as we know, true. In fact, it's so true that it's why I haven't mentioned the country I live in during this video. So people in Central African countries flee where they live, looking for a better life. People who live on like $1 a day, they leave hoping to find employment so they can feed their families. They run from war, they run from tribal war, they run from famine, they run from terribly abusive situations. They run, and eventually they get picked up by traffickers, and the traffickers bring them to Algeria. In Algeria, they lose their passports, they lose their papers, they lose all their money, and they lose their dignity. Bad things happen to them in Algeria. From Algeria, they're smuggled to the coast, sometimes to the coast of Algeria, but often to Morocco. And through Morocco, to the coast. At this point, they are being told a story about how they can find work in Europe. They don't have a lot of choices, so they believe the story. They make it to the coast where a rubber dinghy, like one of these, waits for them. They wait sometimes for months for seas to be right or someone to take them. 1 in 5 of these, full of women, children, and men, sink in the sea. 1 in 5. That's a lot of people. So of the 5, 2 of them will cost €3,000 to ride, and 2 of them will cost €1,000. Remember, they lost all their money in Algeria. So where will they get this money? They become indentured servants, contracted to work in Southern Europe in a particular place that I'll tell you about in a moment. Now, the €3,000 boats, not per boat, but per person, make it across the sea. The €1,000 boats tip off the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard turn them back. So now they're €1,000 in and have to pay 3,000 more euro to get to go again. They're €4,000 in, these people with no money and nothing, no papers, no anything, no hope. Many of the countries in Southern Europe have an electrical fence, that's a cable under the water that tells them when boats have crossed over. So it appears that authorities are complicit in this. That's all I'll say on this video. These people are brought here. This is called the Plastic Sea. You can see it from space. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres of greenhouses, cheap, propped up greenhouses. This stretch is situated between the mountains and the sea, and when you are on this mountainside, you can't see anything but these greenhouses forever. And it just goes on and on and on and on. And nearly all the people who work in these greenhouses are undocumented, trafficked persons. There are a few Christian workers living in this city, a handful really, trying to do something for all of these slaves. The men work in the greenhouses and the women work brothels. You never are able to pay your debt because you keep costing money to feed. So they never pay you enough to get out of your debt. And the only way to buy your debt off is to have another family member from Central Africa come and replace you. You can enslave a family member to get free. And free will mean that you are an undocumented illegal immigrant with no money in Southern Europe. Where will you work? Well, the only place you can find work without a car and without documents are these greenhouses. This is the hole. It's a long pipe that runs under the freeway. On one side are the greenhouses. On the other side is where you live. One of these apartments has 20 Senegalese men living in it, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, and 20 men living inside. Just squalor in enlightened Western Europe. In John 4:35, Jesus said, "Lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white for harvest." You can see this white harvest from space. Seeing the multitudes, he felt compassion for them. He was moved with compassion for them. And they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. So here's what his compassion drove him to do. He said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, white even, but the workers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." We are finding new teammates who we will equip and help, care for, oversee, but who can go do something about this. We're just on the beginning of this, but we have to get in that hole. Somebody has to get in that hole. So that's how we'd ask you to pray. We'd ask you to pray for us as we await a baby. We'd ask you to pray for our kids as they keep growing and being kids and doing the things kids do. We'd ask you to pray for our staff, that they keep waking up to their whole hearts so that Jesus has more leverage to move them through the world. We ask you to keep praying for the immigrant and the refugee, both here and where you live. We ask you to pray for the Plastic Sea. These people made it across one sea to drown in another. Something must be done. Pray, and let's see what happens. May the grace and peace of Jesus be with you. We love you and are grateful for your partnership. Thanks.